that we wanted to that actually demonstrate how virtual asset market can be regulated. I want to tell you about the results of the meeting, share some cases that we were discussing. All right, so in this slide, I would like to bring you 3 countries as examples that we've discussed during the meeting. So first, UAE, where they adopted a framework law, and at the same time, they have a special regulator, VARA, Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority, that gives a permit, allows the service providers, allows the VASPs to carry out their activities and develop technologies. In UAE, they have a lot of sandboxes, or RAG labs, as they say, that actually give a chance not only for companies to perform their activities and test technologies. It gives a chance for the state not to limit companies in such a way for them to decide to pick another country or other regulator for their activity. Therefore, this is a case where they reached a compromise, between regulation, taxation, and technology. Because we have to realize that technologies always move faster than any state's response or any bank's response. In particular, we have to be ready for that. We have to be ready that if we put a very strict law, it will not be relevant like in a couple of months, because virtual assets are moving with super speed, so fast compared to any regulation we adopt. Okay, a second case is France, and it's interesting for us in the context of regulator, because we already heard today the opinion that it's highly likely that National Bank will be the regulator in Ukraine, but when we if you remember the previous discussion, if it's the National Bank and Securities Commission, or National Bank and Ministry of Digital. And France is a very good example here, because in France, who is the regulator? The Bank of France and the body overseeing the financial markets. So they've started working in 2019 as the double regulator. They took this function, and as of 2023, more than 100 registrations they had. And licenses were provided to VASPs, but I have to focus on one thing. This is a stage-by-stage model of regulation. And in the company, quite often in France, they have questions like how to get additional license to work with MiCA, and only a small share of companies actually were capable to get that license. Why did it happen? Due to many difficulties that MiCA is putting there. You can hear the experts' opinions that MiCA is creating limitations for technology, which is critical for small companies only starting to work in that area. Therefore, this is the reason. French experience tells us that if you over-regulate, over-limit, then it leads to a situation when VASPs, some of them already think about relocation even to other countries. So it's another case. These are simply do's and don'ts. We can check the regulation if it's similar to Ukrainian context to avoid the situation when we over-limit, create too many barriers when companies run to other countries. Unfortunately, we have the situation. We know that many companies who previously used to be present in the market now consider other jurisdictions because there's no regulation. This is just a reflection to the statement given by other speakers that please adopt the law for us to finally start working. And I think that, this is one of the statements from the private sector of Ukraine as well. Because, of course, private sector wants clarity and the framework itself. The last case I'd like to focus on, the one we've discussed in working group, is Moldova. Why Moldova? Because Moldova, in 2023, they actually refused they declined VASPs, but virtual assets ownership and holders themselves were not prohibited. So in a year during NRA, they've identified so many problems which were related to lack of regulation, because it's obvious that users still disposed of virtual assets, and it somehow generated a huge risk for the country, especially during election process. Since 2024, Moldova, again, returned back to regulation after this prohibition period and after MiCA stepped on board. 3 trajectories that countries picked individually. This is their right completely, like they were entitled to do that, to pick the model. But for one, this is one of the messages that Ukraine has to pick a flexible approach to regulation, which truly would allow us to work, the companies, the state, both of them to function and to promote the dialogue. Okay, the following statement that I'd like to raise, what kind of legislation should we have? Initially, we can think that the statements that we get, and it looks very simple, this thing, but it's hard to achieve. The case, as I mentioned, tell us that the law we're about to adopt, it should be like a long-term perspective law. Today, it's one thing. Tomorrow, we have another tokens emerging, new opportunities, new technologies, and market must be pretty flexible, and to actually address these technological shifts. So we have also to consider innovative mechanisms. I spoke of sandboxes today. It's a great practice when users of the market, also market players, can showcase their practices and exchange ideas with the regulator and have feedback exchange. So realistic requirements. Again, when we establish requirements to the companies, which are absolutely not applicable, nobody will get any benefit. It's a lose-lose. So we have to think about balance between being attractive for business and, of course, we have to stick to AML CFT for all our transactions to be properly monitored and for us to avoid any problems later. During the working meeting, we also had some blockchain companies working with virtual assets permanently, and from them we heard a couple of statements. Okay, first of all, they expect cooperation and interaction. That's a great practice when 15 FAT recommendation was only introduced. Back then, FAT was also working with the market players for them to support the drafting of recommendations and methodology and joint practices. In Ukrainian blockchain companies interested for the market to function, they also have some expectation for that kind of cooperation with the public sector. We know that we had this since 2019, this type of cooperation when we only started moving in that area, and now we expect the expectation for that cooperation reaches another level because mostly these blockchain analytical companies are transnational, and for them it's important also to work at interstate level because quite often requests are got for interstate transactions. We need to know how we provide this information, how can it be used. Second, commercial solutions for risks. It's pretty obvious we'll have so many risks related to money laundering. And the question is, those mechanisms that we have in hands now, can these counterbalance the risks? Is it a good response? Because all the information that we use somehow in some way should be verified. And that's the question again. How blockchain companies are cooperating with law enforcement. Because law enforcement bodies may have so many questions eventually on the authenticity of info provided. And in this context, blockchain companies have many questions like how to verify, how to authenticate the information they use, how to work with that. And when we have a case in the court, what shall we do with the info? Okay, and how exactly shall we use it as an evidence in a case? Okay, and the last thing I'd like to focus on that VASPs have to invest in generation of their own internal solutions. It's pretty obvious that for VASPs, it will be important to check a client, check the info and transaction sources of money, and if VASPs are actually capable to fully meet the AML CFT and therefore to run this assessment. Okay, we haven't mentioned banks today in their vision. It's really an important subject. It's a market player as well who will be engaged. Last week, me and my colleagues, we had a chance to talk to representatives of the banking sector. And the key statement that we often hear is that banks are over-regulated. They have so many limitations. It's the most regulated subject in the country. Therefore, expectations from the banks, what are these? That state and interaction in PPP, under PPP, will give a chance to banks also to have clear procedures, know your client, due diligence when they will launch the onboarding of the companies or the subjects, because this is truly important to understand that banks also have some info. They have enough of expertise to actually handle that. And also understanding the business models of banks, which are obviously targeted at getting income mostly. But again, how do we balance here, like between regulation of companies handling virtual assets and all these checks and inspections from banks as the primary fin monitoring subjects? Okay, we have to balance it. We have to hear it from banks also, who will obviously be engaged in the process. Okay, just not to steal your time, recommendations provided by the working group. I would like to stress here, okay, the PPP again in the core, and I'll give you Lithuanian case. In Lithuania, they have PPP. Recently, they've started engaging VASPs, and in the country, there's a situation that they registered 370 VASPs. Only 120 are active, and only 30 of these, respectively, have licenses of MiCA. Therefore, we can see that the trend is similar for many countries. Because of heavy limitations, many VASPs, they are not registering, okay? Just using the Lithuanian case, we can think also about Ukrainian context. How shall we issue licenses to them? If it's going to be clear and simple for all the market players, not to create the regulatory arbitrage, to avoid that if we keep two regulators. Okay, for the regulatory recommendations, still it's transparency, openness, and clear rules and standards for everybody on the field. And to make sure that we reach that, one of the solutions mentioned by Serhiy Rybchenko is the PPP, of course. PPP can actually engage regulator on the one hand, also VASPs will be taken on board, banks, and the rest of subjects engaged in the process. One of the key elements of cooperation, we can also create the key stakeholders roadmap for partnership, for the terms of partnership, and this cooperation will never be there without the trust, okay, between everyone. And trust is built only with permanent meetings, with permanent communication, with dissemination of info to all the subjects. Okay, I will not focus on accumulating potential and experience. I think me and my colleagues will discuss that today. Yeah, the only thing I'd like to mention, you can use the QR code, ladies and gentlemen, and you can get access to the report of this working group meeting. Please check, read, analyze. I really encourage you to do, and we will be so happy to discuss that. Thank you, Ms. Oksana. Thank you. I think these were really interesting ideas and quite helpful ones. There was a huge community engaged in generating these recommendations. So can I ask you, just briefly, please, if there is such a reflection, if there's a remark. So if the draft law, the existing draft law, 10225D, doesn't meet these general expectations and recommendations, to which extent it meets those? Maybe there are some key points, It's clear that with thousands of amendments, we'll not discuss everything, but some key points. Or it's about the regulator again, or it's for the expert community, which are more important.
So during our discussion in the working group, we had dedicated a lot of attention to regulator, and that's an important issue for everybody because, a lot depends on it, including the future steps and recommendations, including the risk assessment, which is absolutely important when we decide which body will be regulator, and the sooner it happens, the sooner we can starting on decisions, methodology, recommendations for all the stakeholders, and without that we cannot move forward. And I personally think that it is one of key issues on which we should concentrate. And when we speak about international standards, we see that international practice is already integrated into the draft law, so we hope that the standards of AML CFT will be still there and won't be changed by the future amendments, only improved if necessary. So thank you, Oksana, and I now give the floor to Vyacheslav Bykov, Executive Director of Charitable Foundation Tabletочки. That's organization which currently involves cryptocurrency to, well, implement charitable projects, charitable goals. So I have a question to you. How does it happen currently from the technical point of view? So the topic of today's meetings, to be or not to be, for the market of crypto assets, but actually it exists already in Ukraine. So, and we have the question of taxation, of regulation. So how do you, well, attract cryptocurrency donations as charitable and CSO? So what are the specificities of your work as a civil society organization? What should be taken into account? Or do we have a general approaches? So speak about the practice of your work, please. Thank you, Natalia. So from the very beginning, if you allow, I want to underline an important issue. Well, today, virtual assets do exist. The market does exist. So we can continue the thoughts of Vita and Metro in the context of creation of the market, establishment of the market, or do we, well, limit it by fence? So we do discuss what the state wants to limit with the fence, but at the same time we acknowledge that there is something inside the fence. It exists already. And the second metaphor we heard is about the roads. Like we want to build roads, not fences. And this metaphor, I think, is great. Why? Because I had to go from Odessa to Izmail. Once there was a road with nobody on this road. Everybody used the nearby field. Why? So how do you think? Are there any road movement rules in the field? No. They well, are enforced only on the road which we build and on which we want people to move. Well, I guess that's what we miss when we speak about virtual assets market regulation. We need to do it in such a form that anyone could conveniently drive that road rather than using the field. And after that, we will be able to discuss rules and norms, and we forgot about this convenience. And why do we create this market? What should be the user experience be of individuals, legal entities? We go too far in the topic of taxation. Like, great, from the very beginning we are describing barriers to this road before explaining people why should they use this road at all instead of using the field. So I guess that's the biggest communication, well, mistake. We didn't explain the use of it for the user. So it would be great to speak more about that and for regulators to work more on that. So if we speak about existing experience, really the donators want to donate in virtual assets. Such wish exists. At the same time, they still wish to donate in fiat currency like cash. And there is legislation which directly stipulates that the object of charity could be anything. Like you can find a beautiful stone on the street, you like it, you think it's valuable, and you can donate this stone to charitable organization, and that's donation as well. And the paradox is that of today, we also include in the same category Ukrainian currency, foreign currency, virtual assets, and everything. So the problem is not regulating the virtual assets, but regulating the process, because the system forgets completely about the fact that donation is not trade operation. Even if funds are sent through the bank transfer, well, it's not a bank transfer, it's a donation. So as of today, any charitable organization, according to existing legislation, is not the subject of financial monitoring, and they can take a suitcase with $10 million. But the question arises, what should this organization who accepted donation in cash, what should they do? And there is no mechanism in the state of how they can act according to law. I will explain in a couple of words. So after receiving that donation, including this donation in their reports, they have to, well, get this money to a bank account. But national bank regulation forbids bank to accept foreign currency from entities except for the currency which was previously given to that entity by bank. So let's imagine the situation. You can't even put 1 cent to your bank account. So we speak about the situation which exists for a long time. We speak about the fiat currency, and now we add virtual currency to this mix, and it's even worse. So there is demand, but like many things in Ukraine, it's solved through so-called peer-to-peer transactions. When we have one person wishes to make a contribution in the virtual currency, we have VASPs usually registered outside of Ukraine, and we come back to the issue of what our state loses, because this activity of such companies can be taxed, and it would, generate income tax, GDP. So we have a company abroad which allow to individuals to meet. One of them wishes to donate and in virtual currency, and one of them have some fiat assets. So on that platform, exchange happens, and as a result, the account of charitable organization receives hryvnias. So is it transparent? Is it good for state? Is it good for organizations? Frankly, no. But the problem is that we don't have any other mechanisms. What is alternative? How me as a legal entity can prove the ownership to this or that asset? How can I transform this virtual asset into fiat, which I can use for payments or for donations? Actually, charitable organizations don't need money as such. They need value which can be transformed into aid, into social impact. And if I cannot transform virtual asset into socially valuable impact results, if there is no road, if I have to use the field and I damage my car, and there could be even landmines in the current situation. So in such situation, no one will go into that direction. And it can be even worse. We can build a road, but people will still keep using the field. And that's the biggest problem when we speak about regulation of virtual assets. And when we add AML context to that mix, because the virtual assets as such are not the problem. Let's be frank, what is the percentage of agreements of real estate market or used cars market So what percentage of agreements are set in cash? Well, so the problem is not virtual currency. The problem is fiat cash, which can be used to buy a brand new BMW. So maybe let's look at that for the people to not have the necessity to, well, exchange cryptocurrency for black cash. Maybe that's the problem, and we forget about that. Thank you, Vyacheslav. I guess there were many right questions dealing with the issue of sanctions in the future regulation, and we didn't raise that question before because we discussed the standards, the requirements from international partners, which also should be taken into account. But from what was said on the first panel, and having listened to you, I think that the most probable outcome is the creation of the road and the parallel existence of the well, country roads through the field. So how can we avoid that situation? On the previous panel, Dmitro said that probably the best option, some compromise, is the transition period during which the taxation issue maybe won't be raised, or maybe there are some different tools which we should well use for a transition period. So that's my question. Well, I believe that we again come back to taxation. Should we tax or should we not? But I lack the basic things which Vita mentioned. Well, it was maybe difficult for general understanding because she used financial language and the language of financial control, but still she spoke about the standard rules of the play in terms of contacts between two people. What are the well, justification for somebody owning assets, somebody transferring assets? What documents prove that, for example, that I received this asset from this or that person? So, well, also referring to what Dmitro said when he mentioned that the state is not only the ministry, but all of us, we have a question, how ready will people be to leave their personal data, to confirm all the transfers and donations? Like me, Vyacheslav Bykov is donating this or that. Frankly, when I asked today the donators to leave some of their personal data like name or contacts, we don't even speak about some AML procedures, some simple things. And people are not ready to do that. They want to stay anonymous, and we are the people. And before we are ready to, well, to be conscious and consciously recognize that we initiate some operations, that we make donations, that we purchase cars, property. Before that, it won't work. And coming back to the most important part, we must explain why is it good for us. When I bought iPhone on Berdichev market, I don't have service, I'm not protected from fraud, and I may later find out that the phone was stolen. When I come back to the market, I can't find a seller, and if I do, he says that he sees me for the first time, so I'm unprotected. On the other hand, if I buy that phone in the official store, when I have a receipt which proves that I bought this phone officially, I have a guarantee, I have service, so if something goes wrong, I have a way to protect myself. So that's the value of this road as compared to field. And that's why I want this cash registers, I want the official gadgets, not some gray inputs. That's the value. And we still haven't explained to the people what is the value of regulated market of virtual assets. And before we do that, before we explain it to people, it's hard to expect that people will use it and well, refuse other practice. So I have a short question. This draft law 10.225D, do you support it or not? Is it a step in right direction to what you are describing, or it creates some additional obstacles? Well, I'm ready to agree to that draft law because it's something, but actually I would well, it would have no from me. And I give the floor to Petro Bilik, partner, technology and investment practice, Yuskotam company. So from you, we would like to hear about how currently the business works, consulting business works in virtual cryptocurrencies market, which exists in Ukraine, as we all agree. What are the difficulties? What are the prospects for development of this market in Ukraine? How should it be regulated for the market to develop and develop in the right direction, so that these crypto funds will stay in Ukraine? Please correct me if I don't use the right terminology. So to avoid capital, well, flight to different jurisdictions. Well, thank you. That was a great question. And here Ukraine is, from one point of view, lucky in three aspects. First, we have a well high mass adoption of virtual assets. If we take a look at well world rankings, we as citizens of Ukraine are ready to trust these assets, to own them, to use them. And someone may say that it happened after the war, but if we take a look at 2020, we see that Ukraine was at the first place at the in terms of virtual assets operations. Second, despite the paradox situation of not having a law to regulate that, if we take a look at public officials, members of parliament, we see that Ukraine is in the top lists worldwide in terms of virtual assets ownership of public officials. We see that they buy them, they sell them, and there is a market, the world market, and the members of parliament use it. And there is a question, what do they do with it next? Where do they buy it? Where do they sell it if we don't have any registered exchanges in Ukraine, because the regulator set some limitations for that? Well, next, if we look at the world companies, a lot of them, like Solana, Everstake, Whitebit, Trusty, and others, were founded by Ukrainians. And these are working on the world market. And the founders of these companies are Ukrainians. So, generally speaking, business is ready to work with these assets, and they are looking forward. They're studying the opportunity to start projects in this sphere, technological projects, interesting projects. And if we look at the world landscape, we see that even Cayman Islands, Seychelles Islands, British Virgin Islands already regulate virtual assets, and Ukraine still does not. So from the business standpoint, we can say that business even doesn't need some special regulation, because it means additional obligations which should be fulfilled. But in Ukraine, we see that we have virtual assets notion terms in civil code. We have explanation of tax administration. We have a possibility to transfer, to give, well, to have virtual assets in your will, to exchange them. You can exchange them for real estate, we have cyber crimes, we have court cases and registers. So there is a market, but as soon as you face this market working with banks, they ask you and they tell you that the regulator prohibits them to have operations with virtual assets, which when you face reporting issues, taxation issues, there are also different views on this legislation.
Different opinions of state bodies, because they expect some special draft law to emerge that will regulate this, but they don't apply the existing clauses and acts they have. So in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, there were amendments presented to fin monitoring legislation where they spoke of the VASPs, and the concept, the very definition of VASP was put there. So back then we picked this principle, like we took the regulation of EU market as exemplary concept. So today we spoke of France already, and many other countries presented as cases as Poland, only 1,600 VASPs before MiCA were registered, like more than 1,000. So this regulation was taking place only at the level of fin monitoring laws, and for European regulators, that was enough to control the market, to give new opportunities. And many Ukrainian entrepreneurs, when they see this ambiguity, domestic ambiguity, when they compare it with clear rules abroad and a huge potential in market is there for the users, of course, they flee abroad. They entered the foreign market purely from the business standpoint, and we lose companies. We just lose companies who potentially would be able to become the VASPs and like pay taxes to budget due to this ambiguity, lack of clarity. So regardless of whether the draft law is adopted or not, when it's adopted, market already exists. So we would love this market to evolve, to grow. And we would love international players to enter the market, of course, and to have very clear rules, like understanding how this process is functioning. What is the algorithm? We would love to have this path as smooth as it should be, in a functioning one, with no barriers. But what is the obstacle? Ambiguity and lack of clarity. There is some regulation at a certain extent, but there's no bridge between business and state regarding those assets. So in my personal opinion, adoption of this special legislation at least will help to explain both parties how shall we interact in future in that matter. And of course, I would love both regulator to communicate more actively to the market, just explaining like what is that, how it's going to work. And truly, I would love us to disseminate the idea that we need regulation, not because in the EU they have MiCA on board, but just because we want to engage investment. Okay? We want to attract investment. We want to create new jobs eventually. And if those present in that area, for them to be free in transactions and exchange, and not trying to use some shadowy structures to actually handle the funds. Thank you, Petro. Thank you so much. Before this panel, we had a chance to talk a little bit informally, and you've already mentioned some things, some practical difficulties for organizations and people for their activities who really are willing to, who declare that they are ready to work with crypto assets. This is just the interaction with the banks, it goes to that part. So coming back to this legislative initiative that is currently perceived as the optimal solution. So you also have this idea, you agree that in the edition that is offered, the polished one must be adopted. At least some regulation should be there, at least some framework, but not the total ambiguity. Okay, speaking of taxation, is it beneficial or not? or is it certain barrier area? I do agree completely with colleagues that truly there are so many other things that have to be, discussed and put to the surface. We also provide this follow-up and support for clients from large crypto companies. Some top managers or founders of the companies are Ukrainians, and they are the tax residents of Ukraine. Therefore, we help them to declare their income generated by virtual assets, submitting these declarations annually. They pay taxes respectively. For example, if they live in the US within some period of time, but if they are not considered to be tax residents of the US, tax residents of Ukraine even minimizes the tax load compared to the situation if they had this full tax residency of the US, okay, or other countries. So it's even beneficial for them at some point. That's why they pay and they submit the reporting. Of course, it's hard to compare people who already have some fixed income and fixed assets, and maybe those who have like a smaller amount of that, maybe they would like to have some conditions for virtual assets, some frame. If, for example, you are an investor and you, for quite a long time, you've been an owner, a holder of these virtual assets, you could actually, maybe a possibility for you to get a taxation privilege, okay, depending on the amount of the assets, okay, for the amount of the assets defining the privilege, those you sell or acquire. So still, it's a subject of discussion. And coming back to your question on the draft law, in my personal opinion, currently we have it's worth moving forward to adoption of the edition that we all discussed today. But considering the amount of amendments introduced, it's really worth fighting for improvement of the draft law, making it better than the edition we have now. So we still have to polish it between the readings, the second and first, depending on how these amendments shall be processed. This whole thing will give us an idea if society and business actually perceive these positively, if we all move in the same direction eventually, if we have two parallel lines, those who actually support that and those who are trying to detour in the field, let's say. Yeah, so a lot will depend on that. Thank you, Petro. Thank you so much. I hope we'll get a constructive process and that there will be a chance to engage for us eventually to have the best option possible of the law. So, the business community vision, like their vision on how should the legislative regulation for cryptocurrency market develop. So, Vladislav Tsirkun, Vice President on International Law Enforcement and Institutions Global Rights Letter. So, Vladislav, a question that goes to you now. A technical one. So if I understand correctly, so you generate technological solutions for banks just to track transactions with cryptocurrencies. Okay. Are we able, so is it possible for us to consider cryptocurrency operations with a high risk, a riskier one when it comes to origin of the funds? Because for CSOs, for the civic sector, this is quite a sensitive thing in terms of FT legislation. So, in general, if we speak of the solutions and the context of regulation to be introduced, if you have something to tell about that, we'll be so grateful. Thank you. Well, first, I represent here today the MDS CSO. It's again about PPP. I'm the expert of the organization. And we have police, cyber police there on board, Economic Security Bureau, AML-CDF providers, and the Global Ledger is one of them. So we're trying to create the non-biased vision towards the market and just to make sure that you know what the problems are there for the state and the regulator, law enforcement, and business. Okay. I was taking notes during discussion, to be honest, the very same discussion we've had for years already, and with basically the same people on board. And quite often it turns into a metaphor competition at some point, like, yeah, metaphor pageant. So Vyacheslav gets the golden prize, so the state lost its last post, powerful one. Okay, let's have a step back. Let's step back. So what we talk about, we have a draft law, like with hundreds of pages, with thousands of amendments already rotating around it. So we need a couple of days together here and discuss it step by step, piece by piece, and maybe these should be different draft laws because these actually address different things. And one draft law may not be quite feasible, but we'll lose time. Okay, so it's so great that we recognize the market, that it exists. Eventually, we as a global ledger company, we've launched a survey for Ukrainian market upon the request of Ministry of Digital and other countries. We have data from other companies. So Ukrainian market, in some metrics, we take we're the top 2 or 3, sometimes the very top. Okay, we're at some point like close to Belgium when it comes to cryptocurrency, but we have the war, you know? And we are the neighbors of the most sanctioned country in the world. Maybe China gets its part as well, but anyway. And it creates huge risks for us. The very fact that today we don't have regulation, it's not even the business issue, but it's the national security thing, okay? So we're not just losing money, we're actually losing property. People are killed in Ukraine. People die in Ukraine because these terrorist attacks, we cannot prevent those. We cannot prevent those incidents, and this is not mentioned by the state, but step by step. The market is huge. Companies, these OTC or cash desks, yes, these are like boxes. OTCs are cash desks, like we have many of those, yeah? But this is like a new trend, trying to turn these into seeing these as root of evil at some point. From our surveys, from our studies of other companies, 70% at least of those, they keep money in the infrastructure of centralized exchange points. Centralized exchange points, starting from FATF and regulation they have, the local regulation, they cannot introduce or they cannot launch their activity at least without one provider like Global Ledger, Crystal, whatever, on board. This is worldwide. This is more than one continent quite often. So they have a couple of providers there. So checking the money going through those boxes, it's already covered with 70%. So it's not a huge problem like this. Then it goes to DeFi regulation and WASPs regulation, or CASPs, as they call it in Europe, whatever. The story is like that. It's not like these are not regulated. No, we can't say this. We have a case of Tornado Cash founder in detention, you know, in 2023. In summer 2023, there was an explanation that if DeFi is established, you can see that its key purpose is to evade taxes or criminal, illicit activity, whatever. So it can be easily proved by analytical soft. You can actually charge him as WASP or CASP. You know, ask why they had this logic since 2019. It's because of the structure and technical specificity. WASPs and CASP, they have wallets where they keep your money. Okay, and coming back to your question, if cryptocurrency, if it's a risky one, so if we don't look through it at some private coins in Monero, not many of them, and these are forbidden for listings in big platforms, with some global money laundering doing, there's no liquidity. What we will eventually get, the situation will be the following. If we speak of DeFi, this is the technology or a certain algorithm. So I can have a transaction there with the same amount as the terrorist did or other business, calculate which time it takes to go through, check all the points where they get their liquidity from because this is open data, and I can later actually investigate, or the state is investigating, which is impossible with WASP or CASP. Binance is responsible for at least 50% of transactions of centralized exchange points. This is a lot. So you actually put money there from your deposit wallet. It goes to the core wallet where all the money is stored. And then all transactions between Binance subjects are not reflected in the blockchain. So it's their private ledger, let's say, or accounting whatsoever. If you want to go to if you want to leave with other cryptocurrency, it's not a problem. It will not be an exchange operation. They have to meet all these requirements because they deteriorate the data from blockchain. Not all the data, the majority of data, they keep for themselves, all right? So that's why we ask them about this reporting. Saying that DeFi is not a subject of taxation, if I make a DeFi with some, fee that I get, this is my income still. It's like the same thing like find money in the street. Therefore, it's not an issue that DeFi is a super life hack, like how to create that to avoid taxation. FATF are very smart people. They talk to us, we cooperate with them, and many of our colleagues cooperate with them. So if you read the guidelines, they explain it in a plain language, okay? It's not a problem. So in general business, many businesses are registered in European countries. I don't know if they have motivation to register in Ukraine in the future. For example, if they already paved this difficult way since the beginning of registration when they registered in Europe, and now they are trying to register under MiCA, getting the license, okay? So they've been into two circles of hell. Why do they need now another third circle? Why do they need to downgrade to Ukrainian level? Why downgrade? It's a huge market. It's not regulated, literally. These were huge possibilities. Like, why do we need that regulation? Why do we need that regulation? I spoke of the security. Why?
Because we are at the top of the list of these issues. It means that if we take all the exchanges, we don't have a lot of centralized exchanges, even according to traffic analytics, which I don't like, because you can be a Ukrainian in United Arab Emirates or something like that. They would have at least 1% of income from Ukraine, which means that they must get license in Ukraine because they get profit. And according to that, all large exchanges will get licenses to continue getting profits from Ukraine. And for us as a country which is a state of war, it's important, and we can, well, have some requirements for licensees, and we can simplify the work of our law enforcement bodies, including fighting terrorism, because more than 90% of terrorist operations financing is done in virtual currency. If someone calls you now and says, I can do something nice for Ukraine, like blow up the State Duma of Russia, and will ask for $10 million in parts from different parts of Russia. Well, you won't be able to do that because it was an anonymous call, and that's why such operations are impossible. And let's imagine another situation. We, with Vladislav, are sitting in the bar and receive such call. We can use these multiple exchange points which exist in Ukraine. So a car will bring money in half an hour. They will take 30% fee. They are not. They are still anonymous, and that's a huge problem. It is used against us, the cryptocurrency, and besides, the money laundering by Russia is well done using our country. So we help them to circumvent sanctions. Well, a list of special parameters for PEPs was mentioned here. I believe it violates a lot of norms, but in general, how do sanctions on cryptocurrency work? Well, they are issued by name. So if we look at existing examples, for example, there is some username and some amount of wallets. And the problem is not who is politically exposed person, but whose data is used. Because in this sphere of cryptocurrency, the initial source of data is not the sanctioned body. In fiat currency, a fiat says that bank is sanctioned, that person is sanctioned, and mission complete. But blockchain peculiarities don't allow to do that. That's why it's important for business to avoid secondary sanctions, because cryptocurrency works not only in Ukraine. If we have exchange, it works not only in Ukraine, it also works in other countries and must comply with regulations of law enforcement bodies in those countries. If they don't, then most of blockchains, tokens, which are well higher than newer than Bitcoin, to say in simpler words, every tokens which have smart contracts could be frozen. Well, and it's a deep discussion which is not for this meeting. Well, summarizing, I'd like to say that we must license, and we should have done that 3 years ago. Discussion about taxes and everything else is very, well, tricky, because I believe that state is in debt before its citizens, because we do not, well, comply with all FATF requirements, and we are going to join European Union, and they have MiCA regulation there, and we are still lagging behind. So I guess that some, well, incentives must exist, and if we know that we have one of the best potentials in the world in terms of users amount and technology, etc. And for the last 6 years, all these people had to use services in other jurisdictions. Now the state must give something to these people, not just the draft law. I have well, review of that draft law on many pages, but we don't have time to discuss all of that. But to be frank, it's not a result of 6 years of work. In business, those people would have been fired. But I support the idea that we should launch at least something. But I, well, guess that we must take some time before deciding on taxation. We should start with licensing first. And this topic was raised last week in Rusi, and we said that separate licenses must be given to providers. They have their databases, they have data acceptable, admissible in courts, and we don't have some great amounts of those operators, just 6 or 7 of them, and all other are taking data from there. So if such provider had opportunity to ask where the money goes, even without, well, some passports, and some law enforcement actions could be possible in that terms. So this topic is huge. There is chaos, and I guess the problem of this draft law is that it tries to fix everything in at once. That's why it's huge and large, and I believe that we should move in smaller steps, step by step. Thank you, Vladislav. We have a reflection remark. I would like to say that Vyacheslav and Vlad told us a lot about not explaining value and national security. So I wanted to add to that. I guess that we, well, didn't explain the threat of virtual assets being not regulated. Our experts studied these issues, and now we can speak about the money mules. Then the bank community have a large problem with that, and a lot of money mules are shifting to virtual assets. And besides that, we can speak about hub for transit of Russian funds. We can speak about, well, enlisting some teenagers for acts of sabotage and diversion. So we can speak not only about the value of virtual assets, but also about threats. And when we start speaking about some real threats and highlight these cases on national level, then we will understand that virtual assets can do harm if nothing changes. So thank you for your comment, Oksana, and I guess that it was a very good thought by Vladislav, who said that the state is in debt before its citizens, and that there is no decision at all, good or bad, there is no decision at all. And here we have a question of step-by-step movement, which you mentioned. Do you see some, well, opportunity, some future, some possibility for these thousands of amendments to be processed, or we should just add a transition period, solve the taxation, well, not go too deep into taxation, and from what you said, taking into account all the previous work done, and we heard the members of parliament today, we heard the government. So what should be next? Well, I guess that not all people working on such topics are experts. So there are a lot of discussions, but not everything is always, well, valuable. It's my personal opinion, not the opinion of my company, just my personal. So there are different ways of integration. We can take some CIS country which is in a similar situation to us, like Kazakhstan. They made a huge leapfrog. Investment is huge in Kazakhstan. And as far as I know, the legislation is difficult there because it was not well suited for virtual assets. So they created that sandbox in their local, well, digital ministry. So I am for the creation of such local sandboxes, start of work, and then the national bank, whether it wishes or not, they will have to issue the licenses because it is a common practice. Well, in most countries, national bank issues such licenses because they communicate with other national banks. Why? We have the MiCA regulation, but still entities are getting licenses in other countries. So we look at a business, at a company, we can look in which countries do they have such license. And National Bank of Ukraine can communicate with National Bank of Spain and discuss some companies and the violation of the licenses which were issued in Spain. So it's a tool of leverage because companies often ignore law enforcement body when they contact them via email, for example, and just nothing happens. So I am for the creation on the basis of Ministry of Digital Transformation of something because we have to start somewhere, and I guess that the issuing of licenses should be given to National Bank of Ukraine. And as for your general remarks concerning the banks and virtual assets, well, we know that less than 5% of banks consider own infrastructure for cryptocurrency. They use existing exchanges. So the question of banks, well, is of other nature, like through banks, the state fulfills its obligation to the citizens. And if a bank has an assets which can devaluate by many dozens of percent instantly, so the question arises, what happens if they lose 20% of their assets instantly? So thank you, colleagues. I believe it was a great discussion. And if you allow, we have a question, maybe common to everybody. Maybe we'll start with Vyacheslav, who has experience of NGO work. So, should we think about some additional criteria or conditions for work of NGOs with cryptocurrency, because as far as I understand, this draft law which is being considered has a provision which prohibits to deposit cryptocurrencies on your savings account. But for organizations, it is important to keep some assets maybe and use personal wallet of organization without some additional tools. So should we in this sphere of NGOs think about some specific features, specificities, or no? To be frank, I guess that the specificities of NGOs is not worth thinking about. We shouldn't think about that. Every time when I hear about peculiarities of NGOs, I am annoyed, because in such moments we separate NGOs from a classic organization, institution, etc. And any non-governmental organization, a non-profit organization, like the school you studied at, the university you studied at, is also non-profit organization. The hospital is non-profit. If you look at world models of healthcare, we already mentioned Spain. The Catalan model was the model for our current healthcare system. So in Spain, most of the clinics are private, non-commercial, non-profit organizations. And do they need some special regulation different from commercial clinic? No, they do the same thing, but the profit is not distributed among owners, but is returned to fund the activity of the organization, to expand activity, etc. So when I hear about something specific for a non-profit, my answer is no. And if we speak about the cryptocurrencies, I have only one request for the state. Please create conditions for me legally, transparently transformed hryvnia into cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency into hryvnia back. That's all. Thank you, Vyacheslav. I have another request. We have some time still, so this is a request to all speakers. Maybe you could say a few words in conclusion describing the regulation of cryptocurrency market. If you allow, let me start with Dmitro.
Thank you so much. I do support that about charity, nonprofit subjects. That I've been dealing with various jurisdictions in the world, globally. I don't observe anywhere establishment of special laws, just regulating specifically the nonprofit organizations handling virtual assets. Okay. A lot of nonprofit organizations we have which are engaged in world structures like foundations, global ones that actually are gathering some donations, delivering grants to develop infrastructure, whatever. So within certain projects, yes, so they support the development of infrastructure and ecosystem of virtual assets. When it goes for legislation, in my specific opinion, my personal opinion, as I told you, we have to, maybe it's worth fighting for us, for the current version, for the current edition to improve it, for these proposals, for these offers, just to be, for these amendments at least to be somehow reflected in the second reading, for some of them to pass the second reading. Secondly, who will actually be the regulator eventually, and how this regulator will communicate to the market, to citizens, from the bylaws. Many things will depend on bylaws. And truly, at a couple of conferences, we've discussed this already, and we've asked people. From our experience, more than 60, 70 even % of citizens, they really positively perceive legislation. in a certain format without going deeply to details, People say yes to laws, but when we ask who shall be the regulator, well, via proactive communication Ministry of Digital and more passive communication of other state bodies and agencies, many citizens observe that, there's a ministry that at least is introducing an idea that somehow is perceived by the crypto community and companies handling cryptocurrencies. But speaking of other regulators, so far it can be just a black box, a sort of a black box where it's pretty, nobody knows like how will they issue those licenses, if that's going to take, how much time that will take, and so on. It's clear. Third thing, it was raised in the discussion that yes, there are so many international players already in the context in European market. They're active now in the US. They are in the process of adopting their own laws. And the positive aspect of the current draft law, what that is that certain simplified processes are introduced for foreign players from specific jurisdictions for them to get this license faster in Ukrainian market. And there are also some transition periods established for those virtual assets which may be allowed to use in Ukrainian market. Okay, what we would really love to have, we'd really love this to shift to practical dimension without any penalties, with a certain transition period, to make sure that we can launch the market without regulatory pressure, without any pressure from, let's say, law enforcement and tax agencies, and actually give people time to get used to the new tool. And ensure deeper integration in the process. Yeah, we have only 5 minutes, please. Yeah, I just want to support the statement on the regulator. Yes, the definition of the regulator itself, the identification of regulator, it's one of the core steps for us to stop throwing the ball from one part to another, to know who are we working with, who analyzes the risks, which methodological recommendations are given to the whole market, and how do we actually move forward. So secondly, as an advocate of the PPP, I absolutely should mention the interaction of public and private sector. Of course, we need to have joint efforts, and these efforts that not only go from one player. Everybody has to be interested in this cooperation and enthusiastic about it to draft these recommendations and future steps, because this is shapes our future trust. This is what shapes our future trust when the law is adopted already, and when all the stakeholders interact with each other. Thirdly, increasing the capacity. Vladislav said that we have so many people engaged in the process, and they will be engaged. They will be engaged in future, of course. Banks, law enforcement. So, increasing our capacity, help us understand how the virtual asset market works. Trainings, permanent interaction, and also taking some good practices on board from other countries. Europol working group, for example, that focuses also on virtual assets in particular. So we have to move in that direction as well. I already spoke of this, that, we have to start with licensing. Oksana puts it properly that it would be great to have, initially one responsible agency, actually, who would take the responsibility, because there's a feeling like everybody there is to blame apart from the state, and the state is some vague, abstract thing with so many agencies on board. Yes, one responsible authorized body. There are different approaches to licensing where the wallet is tied, but we're one of the leading countries. Why can't we have some leading practices making these like virtual offices where WASP can actually dynamically introduce their wallets they have to use? There are technical risks where wallet can be compromised, and one has to relocate quickly and make a new wallet. One must have a chance to send a message to an office like Dia City, like that. So saying that this is my wallet. Tokens, verification tokens can be sent. There are tools. Licensing. Secondly, interview those who face it every day with a request to licensees, not only law enforcement, also from the business itself. We need to get feedback. To create unique licensing conditions, some things maybe should be done, we should make it more strict because of the environment, giving a chance to investigator to send requests on cases related to terrorism or whatever, and to oblige the licensee just to, within an hour, to give some feedback. Have a specific manager to talk to law enforcement. Collect all the offers, all the wishes, and implement a licensing environment. And in the rest, use European practices and MiCA to back up. For me, the first step is, I don't want to use the word regulator because it's so much about regulation, but just identify the authorized, the responsible subject. Who should be responsible for designing and implementing mechanism for cryptocurrency functioning in Ukraine? So today we can see that it's National Bank. Yeah, okay, National Bank. The first thing they will do, and they should do, permits, licenses. What should be done? Which licenses should you get? Which criteria? To finally get an agency where as an individual I'm going to that agency if I need to. Online, I can contact them. I have certain IBAN from them. I transfer money from Ukrainian bank or use Ukrainian card, get a virtual asset, and then this virtual asset, I sell it and I get money in the Ukrainian account. And Ukrainian bank takes the money. Why? Because they know that AML procedure in this license structure is there. So the agency is licensed and they can send it to bank. That's it. We have the exchange, currency exchange points. We have licenses for them and all the regulations, you know. And National Bank is responsible. National Bank can also draft this for the cryptocurrency exchange points. Then crypto, stock exchange, and the rest. And maybe the regulator will be different there, but initially, let's identify the responsible subject and the very first step, simple to be taken. Thank you so much, dear speakers. It was really interesting for me to get your feedback. I do hope that we all are moving in the proper direction, and we're harmonizing our legislation to the EU acquis. We're in the process, and of course with our partners. The service function that we've been discussing, it has to be, it's all about convenience, okay? When we launch the market, cryptocurrency market. This is about the convenience, yes, that will allow us to perform better, okay? And it will be really interesting to work in Ukraine. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. If we have a minute. No, we don't. We're out of time. No final word to Maria. Thank you so much, dear panelists of the first and second panel and colleagues. Thank you. I hope we'll have this opportunity to meet each other at some expert discussions and that we'll finally have this law